The city was silent at night, with only the moon peeking out from behind the clouds. A frightened Rhodes was sitting in his room, tied to a chair by ropes near the table, not knowing what was going to happen next. Across from him, Rhodes sat with a calm expression on his face, his hands folded in front of him. The man decided to encourage the criminal so that he would not be so afraid. After all, when lives are at stake, people tend to be greedy. They will do anything if they get the chance. The criminal did not understand what this man was trying to do. Rhodes shared his thoughts that leaving him without a head would be too cruel. This gave Rhodes hope that he was ready to be forgiven. The young frontline soldier wanted to make sure that he returned all the money. Rhodes was happy and agreed to do so, on the condition that he first receive forgiveness. The owner graciously agreed that receiving forgiveness was the meaning of their existence. Rhodes could not fully understand what the man who caught him was up to. But suddenly the Roid wanted to add one more condition. After all, the criminal was ready to do anything for forgiveness and release. He only had to sign the contract brought by the swarm. The man explained that it was a standard labor contract under which the criminal could even receive a salary. But the main nuance was that 80% of his salary was deducted by the owner to pay off the debt. Rhodes was not amused by this nuance. After all, only in 520 years would he be able to pay off the swarm. This was not the best prospect for a criminal, because it was a considerable sum. As Gabriel expected, his host did not come here to sympathize and forgive. But the young front man is not stupid enough to take the life of someone who owes him money. He would not have made such a rash move. He intended to suck him dry until the end of his miserable life. The depressed Rhodes wanted to know why, for the sake of all the good things in the world, they were offering him such a slave contract. These words surprised the young Frontera. They had no choice but to force him to sign the contract. It was time to resolve this issue in court. The criminal signed his slave contract through tears and despair. The sun was gently shining outside. A chariot with 3 men was driving along the forest road. Gabriel told his master that he had managed to get some money out of the roads. It was enough to pay the interest for several months. However, the owner replied that the money would be used solely for construction. In his opinion, 30 workers were no longer enough. Frontera wondered why none of the townspeople responded to his job posting. Perhaps his reputation simply preceded him. A few days later, the men returned to their hometown of Frontera's estate. A sign said they needed labor. They were willing to pay 20 gold pieces each. After a while, a line of eager men lined up at Royd's table. The man was surprised to meet all these people because he thought they hated him. Gabriel was sure that they did, but his owner promised to install the heating system on time and at a low price. He also punished the traitor of the estate by making him appear before a higher court. Royd said he would become a reliable person who could be trusted. He couldn't believe it was that simple. His thoughts were interrupted by a man who was next in line and was interested in the job. The owner showed him what exactly and how to sign. But before that, the man wanted to express his gratitude to the Baron's son. Royd was a little shocked by these words. The man shared that his baby could easily get sick as soon as it gets a little cold. But thanks to the young owner and his system, this year he won't have to worry about it. The man sincerely thanked the Baron's son and made a low bow. Royd was extremely touched by the man's sincerity. He was a little embarrassed because his real goal was to satisfy his own hunger for money. The man added that he had relatives in the Raycon estate, which was nearby. They too would like Royd to install his underfloor heating system in their home as well. For the man, it was the first step to prosperity and expansion in the future. It turns out that all this was not in vain. He immediately thought about raising the price of his services, explaining that it was due to the additional travel costs. His face showed his readiness to take the money right away. This, in turn, worried Gabriel. But the man really needed the means to get all the materials to the site. Gabriel couldn't believe that this whole construction had only one mercenary purpose: Why else would Roy build a road in the middle of the city? Meanwhile, the men reached the top of one of the hills outside the city. While admiring the view, Roy decided to talk to his servant. He told Gabriel that sooner or later there would be nothing left on this mountain. Xavier did not understand what the master meant. He explained that the creation of a heating system would require a lot of money. Therefore, very soon only stumps would remain of the trees growing here. Gabriel was puzzled by what he heard. He did not understand why the owner wanted to continue doing this if he knew that all the trees would disappear. That's why Roy decided to stop the construction of the Appian Way. Instead of using wood, they would start mining coal from a cave near the town. Roy has already started planning how he will sell it at a high price. Because when the news of his heating system reaches the masses, people will simply not be able to resist such an attractive offer. But for the residents of their city, he wanted to make a discount, but a relatively small one. Gabriel thought the owner's plan was unfair and cruel. Does he really think Roy is like that? But if the man refuses to do this, they will not be able to pay the debt for the estate. Gabriel understood this, but still thought Frontera's views were wrong. The servant agreed that they had no choice in the matter. But he still decided to warn his master against it, because the Baron did not know about his son's plans, and if he did, he would not just leave it alone. Earlier, other townspeople had also tried to start mining coal again and again. Roy knew that it all ended in a collapse due to the unreliability of the ground. But the man was positive and believed that he would succeed, thanks to modern technologies for earthworks. After all, he knew how the shield method of passage works. He worked with a movable prefabricated metal structure that ensured safe mining operations and the creation of permanent fortifications inside it. Roy was ready to go because he and Gabriel had great things to accomplish, even though he had no idea about this new and unknown technology. He wanted to see what his radically new master could do this time. The men decided to return home. The entrance to the old cave, which had been used to extract minerals, was almost completely blocked with stones. The cave stretched for tens of meters into the hollow. Suddenly a strange creature came out of the darkness in the depths of the rock. It had long black sensitive antennae-like antennas. Here and there in the darkness, the red eyes of other unknown creatures sparkled. They were giant ants, a whole army of them. Each of them had a strong, pointed jaw and large, shining red eyes. They were all heading to the smell of new prey from outside. Roy clapped his hands together in concentration. After that, he began to create a magic symbol with his hands. He gained energy and transformed his magic into a large beam of light, which the man launched into the sky, saying that he had the best apartment in Cannes, one of the richest neighborhoods in Seoul. The magical stream instantly soared above the clouds, and then it disappeared over the horizon, leaving behind a small star. In a few seconds, the man was standing outside the best and largest house in the richest neighborhood of Seoul. He wanted it to be true, but unfortunately, Roy didn't have that kind of cool skill. In fact, Frontera was sitting at his desk, just drawing blueprints for a plan to create an underground exit using his own magic. He spent a lot of time on it, though. He received a message that he had only one available skill, which was intermediate level design. He wished that he could hire 100 hardy workers without having to pay them. Although he did like the ability to draw blueprints with magic. Thanks to the incident with the Newman, he was able to earn 639 RP, making a great impression on the Baron, Baroness, Gabriel, and others. He invested these points in upgrading his skills, and was able to acquire new ones. Roy came back to the same cave to determine where to dig. He had one more new mid-level skill available to him, namely underground scanning. The skill allowed him to see only at a distance of 5 meters. That helped him find the right direction to dig. He had only one problem left, which was to drill the passage as quickly as possible. After all, an ordinary person cannot do this, and people quickly get tired of such hard physical work. Potinak could not help with this because he fell ill during the construction of the road. And even if he had recovered, It would have been dangerous to use him because he was too big. But Royd had no other choice. He decided to use the messenger to choose a random mystical creature. After all, the man had enough points to do so. The young Frontera sat dutifully on the road waiting for his new creature from the magic portal. From the magical glow, he could see someone's small head with a bow. In a moment, its smiling face completely emerged from the portal. The tiny pink creature with a bell on its tail fell to the road in front of the man. She came to her senses and looked at her owner with joy, making bell-like sounds. Roddy could not believe that this was the same ruthless machine. Despite its cute appearance, he assumed that it had poison in its teeth. But at first the Podon also seemed so innocent. Surely there was something good to be gained from this little guy. Royd asked if it could grow in size with the help of a red sunflower seed. She confirmed this, and that she also had her own superpower. The man kindly asked her to demonstrate her skills. She smiled in response. A few weeks later, the giant bluebell ate up the ground while moving inside a shield barrel in the cave. In addition to resizing, the bellflower had the first-level earth excavation skill. It also had the first-level soil cultivation skill. Standing behind the giant bell, Royd ordered Xavier to get ready. Gabriel was already sweating profusely, but he was ready with his sword in hand. After all, the second step of the bell shot hot metal. Xavier, on the other hand, used his skill to quickly cut the metal shots with his sword, forming identical tubes from them. Then the brave blacksmiths used tools and fire to turn the tubes into a strong support. The fifth step was to realize the harsh reality. Gabriel didn't understand why a knight like him had to deal with the secretions of a giant snake. Royd confidently led all the processes, despite the fact that he was also completely sweating. He and his team of workers, Gabriel and the snake, moved further and further into the rock. But because of the lack of oxygen, he was starting to feel dizzy. If they hadn't laid a pipe to bring in oxygen, everyone would have passed out long ago. Gabriel said that the owner, like the other workers, needed to rest. Royd refused, because he had to monitor the work process as a supervisor usually does. Although in Korea, managers are all about talking. Sometimes he came across bosses who had never been to their workplace. And at that moment, the young frontline worker promised that he would never be like that and would monitor all the processes himself. Then Royd used his internal scanner to notice something in the rock. It was the very coal they were looking for. He loudly announced to his workers that they had almost reached the goal and that there was only a little more work to be done. The man thanked the snake for the bell because with its help they had completed the job 10 times faster. The owner made an announcement to everyone present that as soon as they reached the coal seam, they would disassemble the shield to expand the space. It was a rather dangerous place, so everyone had to be extremely careful. Suddenly, a knock from the ground behind them attracted the attention of the robot. This puzzled Mr. Frontera quite a bit. Everyone was worried because the ground in this city was strong and should not collapse. The man started his underground scanning to find out what was in the ground. Behind the coal pile, a hole appeared that had not been there before. In a moment, the hole grew larger before his eyes. Suddenly, a giant mutant ant came out of it, scaring the hell out of everyone. Before Royd knew it, the ant had cornered him. Gabriel, unlike his master, was always on the alert. And without any hesitation, he used his sword to cut off the giant pincers of the mutant's jaw. When the young frontman came to his senses, he jumped to his feet and, taking a shovel, desperately ran to the servant's aid. The man used all his anger and strength to finish off the monstrous creature. The mutant was finished, despite the fact that it was much larger than the men. Royd didn't understand how the ugly creature had appeared here, which was not mentioned in the novel. But it was too early for them to relax. After all, it was just one mutant ant, and there was a whole army of them in the crack. The ants were rapidly approaching the crevice, lighting the way with their red eyes. Royd ordered everyone to run quickly to the outside and leave the cave immediately. Xavier bravely confronted the creatures, killing them one by one. Royd could not understand how many of them were left, hundreds or even thousands. If they reached the surface, all the inhabitants of the city would be finished. Gabriel could not hold out much longer because of the lack of oxygen in the cave. Their mine could not be destroyed without explosives. But even if the structure had fallen into disrepair, there was still a chance that ants would get to the surface. Roth did not know what to do. The servant slapped his master to get him to pull himself together, because they certainly didn't have time to panic. Royd didn't panic, he thought, but he didn't have much time. Gabriel could not hold them back for long. The young frontline soldier concentrated and put all the factors together to find a solution. The light bulb in his head was off, but in a moment it began to shine brightly, radiating electrodes in different directions. "This is it." The man picked up the torch and turned to Xavier. He told the servant that they would attack and move forward. It sounded crazy to Gabriel, but he thought it made sense. Xavier continued to fight off dozens of ants with his sword. The men desperately rushed forward to attack the enemies. It was already evening, and one of the workers came running to the frontiersman's estate to tell the Baron the bad news. Arcos was extremely surprised and frightened by the appearance of these creatures. The man also said that all the workers had successfully evacuated, but Xavier and the swarm remained in the tunnel. Baron was about to close the entrance to the mine. The swarm's father put on his armor and, together with the worker, hurried to his son's aid. Gabriel continued to destroy the pests in the cave. He did not understand why they should continue to attack the ants as there were more and more of them. Roydna told him to stop talking because he was busy at the time. The only good thing was that the ants did not come out of their holes, even though the situation was terrible. Xavier was almost on the verge of not caring that it was hot, and there was little air, although there were still a lot of ants. He used his underground scanner to get to the bottom of it as quickly as possible. There had to be methane somewhere in this dungeon. After all, coal is a place where methanogens are distributed. Because of this, layers of methane gas were located throughout the mineral veins. If he could find it, he would immediately blow up the ants. The man looked closely at every corner of the cave, and in a moment he did find layers of methane gas. Royd quickly stuck his shovel into the ground. He asked Gabriel to hold them back while he dug. Royd used all his fast digging skills to reach the layer of methane as quickly as possible. The mutant crept up on him unnoticed, but Xavier reacted quickly, removing the pests from their path. Royd continued to dig tirelessly. Gabriel continued to fight off the fierce creatures. Suddenly, a very loud sound echoed through the cave. In surprise, the men quickly covered their ears and eyes. Coming out of the depths of the tunnel, a huge pink ant, 10 times bigger than the other ants, stood in front of the men. The men realized that it was their queen. Only one of its jaws was larger than Xavier's height. Royd hoped that the servant could overpower her if he tried. But Gabriel objectively understood his strength, so he said it was beyond him. But at the moment, they had no other choice. At that moment, the queen attacked Xavier. The man used his heart of mana to try to keep the defense. The queen's size was considerable, so Gabriel had to look for her weaknesses. But for her, his blows were significant. Xavier was trying his best to hurt her. However, this only irritated the queen to keep fighting. As long as he was holding on, the swarm did not waste a single minute continuing to dig. The servant did not spare himself in the fight with the ant. Suddenly, he heard a strange hissing from under the swarm. The man grabbed a torch and ordered Xavier to run to the exit with him. The furious queen followed them. The men saw the narrow entrance they had used earlier. When they reached it, they quickly jumped in. Royd turned for a moment to see where the queen was. Finding the creature with a glance, the man threw his torch in her direction to eat her. The burning torch fell on her head and bounced to the ground. Her ants were frightened by the fire, fleeing deeper into the tunnel. The enraged queen wanted to end the men. And that's when methane gas leaked through a crack in the tunnel, ignited by the flame from the torch. A moment later, a powerful explosion occurred in the cave. The queen was caught in the middle of it. A few meters away, lying on the ground, Xavier covered his master's body to shield it from the blast wave. The ants watched in horror as their queen passed away, burning in a fiery vortex that in a moment covered them as well. One of the stones landed on Xavier's head, but he continued to protect the young Frontera. At the exit of the mine were the workers, along with Baron and Arcos, who also heard the deep echo of the explosion. The father could not contain his emotions and wanted to follow his son. But at the last moment, he was stopped by Baron, saying that he might get hurt. Then, the men were lying on the ground among a pile of stones and smoke. Royd woke up, because his ears heard badly after such a powerful sound. The man got to his feet, and when he saw the queen's head still, he realized that his plan had worked. Royd looked at Xavier and realized that he had protected him. He then picked up the bell and apologized for the scratches he had received from the explosion. The man looked up and saw that the exit from the cave was blocked by stones. This meant that things were bad. Suddenly, the man began to feel dizzy. He received a warning message that there was not enough oxygen in his body. He knew it himself. That is why he needed to get outside as soon as possible. Using his scanner, Royd estimated the thickness of the rubble to be about 5 meters. The oxygen level was getting even lower. But the young Frontera had no choice but to dig for Xavier and the bell. Gabriel came to and saw his master. Everything swam before his eyes. He could only hear his master saying that they had to get out together. Royd said that he would not leave them. At the same moment, Gabriel lost consciousness and fell to the ground. The messenger expressed his admiration for the young frontier because of his desire not to leave Xavier. Then Gabriel's opinion of him improved by 6 points. This brought Royd's total score to 108 points, bringing his total to 157 points. The man was breathing heavily through his mouth, inhaling the last gulps of oxygen, the level of which was at an extreme limit. In any case, Royd had nothing left to lose. There was less and less oxygen. And then the man pulled himself together and turned to the messenger to activate the search for knowledge that could develop his skills. The messenger started processing its own data. It started scanning the man and looking for the knowledge he needed. It found some of it, namely, mana absorption, mana processing, and mana increase. By combining all these skills, Royd could master the Azrakan core technique. This was exactly what he needed. After all, the young frontrunner hadn't stopped training since his duel with Newman. He was confident that he could develop his skills as far as he wanted. The man did not hesitate to agree to receive such a technique, which cost him 15 RP. In a moment, Royd received the Azrahan's core technique in a 5th level single ring. Then a small blue spark appeared in the dark space. It formed a ring that Royd felt inside of him. Unfortunately, he had no mana in his heart, but he could feel the presence of the mana rings. Inside, he had a 120% expansion of mana. Even if he had been an ordinary person who trained hard, the result might not have appeared immediately. But he had a lot of RP, and he could increase his skill level with the click of a button. Royd decided to move forward and bet everything. His Azrahan's core technique in the single ring increased to level 6. There was a 125% expansion of mana. However, every time he clicked on the upgrade, the cost increased by 5 points. Despite this, Royd continued to level up his technique until he reached the 10th level. For a moment, he thought that he would need these points in the future, but he had little choice. He decided to level up his technique as long as he could. His ring of mana that had been revolving around his heart turned into 2 rings of the 1st level. His mana had expanded by 200%. To increase to the next level, 100 RP were required. But the man had only 7. Royd wanted to know from the messenger how he was doing now, because the number of rings had increased. The messenger informed him that he had 2 skills available to him, such as a 10-minute stretch of life with the ability to not feel tired and an energy burst that allowed him to triple the manga for 20 seconds. Also, these 2 skills had restrictions on use and the amount of 1 time per day. The man accepted this and prepared for a quick dig. Then he activated the skill of the stalker, which allowed him to forget about his fatigue. The man quickly began digging in the direction of the exit. His oxygen level was at an all-time low. In his mind, the man was begging for daylight to show through the crack. He only needed a small space if he could find even the smallest gap. Using his own scanner, the man moved deeper into the earth. The oxygen level was critical. Sweating Royd stopped because he noticed something. It was the very small crack he was looking for. It was the way out. The earth flew from under his shovel even faster than before. Exhausted, Gabriel and the bell still lay unconscious on the ground. Gritting his teeth, Royd continued to bathe without stopping. The oxygen level was running out before his eyes. Royd dug as hard as he could to save his family and himself. He had enough oxygen for just a few breaths. Meanwhile, there were only 3 meters left to his cherished crevice. The exhausted man fell to his knees in despair. His shovel also fell to the ground without strength. After all, ZHYVCHYK's skill had ceased to work. The man sitting on the ground was on the verge of despair. And that's when he decided to use the energy release skill. Royd got to his feet and picked up a shovel. Every second was worth its weight in gold, so he immediately continued to dig aggressively. His skill only lasted for 20 seconds, and he had only 30 centimeters of earth to dig to the rescue hole. Meanwhile, there was no oxygen left at all. Having dug such a large stretch of earth, he did not have enough air and strength for the miserable 30 centimeters. Royd lay powerlessly on the ground, so close and yet so far from the exit. Royd thought about how quickly it was over. After all, as the son of an influential man, living in a remote area, he only dreamed of a normal, quiet life. It seemed as if the story of his life was over. But suddenly, he heard a strange sound that he had heard before. With the last of his strength, Royd stood up on his elbows to see where it came from. At the same moment, a giant hamster, Podong, who had long been familiar to him, emerged from the ground. This made the man very happy, and made him smile at the furry animal. Royd immediately smelled the fresh air outside. This encouraged the man to get back on his feet. He told himself that the quiet life of a baron's son was waiting for him. It was already dark and twilight had fallen on the city. A torch with a bright flame was burning in the cave. Arcus, accompanied by Baron and the townspeople, moved through the tunnel in search of the missing men. Although the night warned the Baron to move on, he was determined to go all the way. For a moment, the man stopped when he saw something in the depths of the tunnel. A few meters away, the silhouette of a man carrying something on his back was moving toward them. It was a Royd rescuing his humble servant. The use of special skills in an emergency situation helped him surpass any limits of human capabilities. The special case, combined with Azrahan's new core technique, had a great impact on the man. However, after that, a new skill of the 3rd level power mode was available to him. With the help of this skill, the core technique was calculated to be able to operate even during severe exhaustion. Frontera's father recognized his son as a soul and ran towards him, shouting his son's name. Confused and exhausted, the young frontier, carrying Gabriel and the bell, did not immediately recognize his father. When the man ran up to his son, the latter lost all strength and fell into his arms with the servant. It was deep night, and it was extremely difficult for everyone. At dawn, the city was already abuzz with gossip and theories about the latest developments. 2 men in the middle of the street were comparing their attitudes toward the young swarm master before and now. One of them said that his nephew was in the very epicenter of the events and saw it with his own eyes. He noticed that when the giant ants attacked people, the owner of the house thought first of all about saving the workers, not himself. It seemed as if the whole town was discussing the exploits of Royd and Xavier. All the residents expressed different opinions and attitudes toward this event, but each of them agreed that this swarm was different from the one they had known before. Meanwhile, the culprit of the gossip was lying in bed in his room under Gabriel's watchful eye. The young frontline soldier needed time to recuperate, but later he opened his eyes. After a long time, Xavier finally saw his master conscious. Royd received a message that the inhabitants of Frontera's estate and the townspeople were deeply impressed by his heroic actions. But whether he would be awake or asleep, the man did not understand what was being said. However, the messenger informed him that he would be rewarded with extra RP points for his outstanding achievements. After this message, his RP scoreboard was updated, and the number of RP points on it was now equal to 507. The man began to realize what had happened to him. He realized that he had become a hero, and in addition to that, he was happy to receive 500 rupiah. The feeling of pride and joy filled him with positive energy. The next morning, the mine was already in full swing. The workers were busy reinforcing the walls of the tunnel and performing their daily duties. Suddenly, a long-awaited visitor caught their attention. Royd Frontera and Gabriel were just returning from the mine when they met the workers. They all paid their respects to the owner and praised him for the fruitful work he had done today. The men looked at their savior with big, sincere eyes. He was different from other nobles, and was a true example of nobility. All the praise and affectionate words made Royd feel ashamed of himself. After all, 2 weeks had passed since the victory over the ants. Therefore, the work in the stone mine was in full swing. Everything seemed to be going well again, however. In such a turbulent time, Royd believed that their safety should come first. He wanted to avoid even the slightest risk of danger. On this day, their main task was to search for ant tracks. Gabriel wanted to ask the owner something, but he insisted that he do it quickly, so as not to waste oxygen. The man asked the swarm why he was constantly putting himself in danger. After all, he could have simply ordered others to do it for him. He believed that it could not be that the owner was only interested in the comfort and safety of ordinary workers. Moreover, as a future heir to the estate, he had to take care of himself and take care of his personal safety above all else. In response to these words, the young frontier called the servant a fool. After all, his real duty was to take great responsibility for all possible risks. Gabriel looked at his young master in embarrassment. Royd explained his position by saying that in this case, even if he threw money around, no one would dare say anything to him. Xavier did not understand whether this was good or bad for him. The messenger informed the owner that Gabriel's level of sympathy was ready to increase, but he suddenly changed his mind. The men reached a blank stone wall. Gabriel suggested looking elsewhere. However, the young frontline soldier was not in a hurry to make conclusions. It seemed to him that there was an empty space inside the wall. Perhaps it was there that the uterus laid eggs, from which new offspring could appear. So the man wanted to verify this theory by digging. And suddenly something surprised him. Inside the wall was a really dense space. The man saw a humanoid green creature with fangs hanging above the ground by its hands, bound by cobwebs on all sides. Also among the victims of the insect mutants were animals wrapped in strong cobwebs. Most of them were horses and pigs. For Gabriel, the green creature seemed dangerous, so he intended to deal with it. It was not a well-considered decision on his part. He wanted to know what kind of creature it was. However, Gabriel explained that it was an ordinary orc. The owner assumed that it was inanimate, but he had heard that ants usually preserve their prey by paralyzing a living organism. This fact encouraged Royd. The man could not hold back his smile, because it was an incredible find for him. On the same day, the men brought a green orc to the fronter's estate. His name was Garrosh. The orc told the men that Royd was his savior, whom he would never forget. Royd wanted to know why the orc always added a kick at the end of his statements, perhaps in order to match his character more harmoniously. However, the orc did not understand what he was talking about. Garrosh turned out to be the son of an Orcish tribal leader. Thanks to the doctor's care, he quickly regained consciousness. He was the son of the leader of the tribe of Steel Sand, and once again emphasized that he would not forget Royda's kindness, and would generously thank the man with whatever he wanted. Royd was greatly encouraged by these words. After all, he had really saved him. And then the young frontier man would ask the stout orc for anything. He needed 120 orcs to work in the mines. However, Garrosh refused the savior's request. The man was confused and sad. He wanted to know the reason for the refusal. For the orc, it seemed suspicious that the swarm had clucked his tongue, as if he were a bad person. However, the young frontier immediately refuted this as a habit, just like the orc's habit of saying the prefix kick every time. Garrosh emphasized that orcs are warriors who follow only the orders of their commander. And since Royd was not a warrior, he could not give orders to orcs. That was the reason. He had heard before that orcs were supposed to go out into the wild upon reaching adulthood and return with the head of a giant ant. Garrosh said that he had made a mistake when he went to the ant's hive, where he was instantly paralyzed. Hearing this, Royd made a new decision, which made the man lick his lips just thinking about it. The young frontline soldier pretended to accept Garrosh's decision and kindly congratulated him on his coming of age by clapping his hands. But Garrosh explained that he had been on his mission and had not brought the giant ant's head back to the tribe, because it could not move once it was inside the insects. Royd did not immediately understand what the orc was talking about. After all, Garrosh had caught and killed the giant ant with him, and its head was hanging on the wall in Royd's room as a trophy. However, the orc could not remember ever having managed to take out such a large ant. Frontera explained that he did not remember anything because he was unconscious. Royd told his new friend that he had witnessed a fascinating sight. When he got to the ant's hive, he saw the queen shaking with fear. She was screaming that she could not believe she had lost to the young year. Garrosh wondered how the mutant ants could understand human speech. But Royd explained that it was true, because they had made great progress in this skill recently. The man emphasized that it was thanks to Garrosh that it was much easier for him to find their hive. Gabriel didn't understand why the owner was so confidently lying to his new friend about his incredible feats. In general, the man wanted to support the orc, who was embarrassed by his failure, and give him hope for the best. Royd put his hands on the orc's shoulders in a friendly manner to finish his speech in a trusting atmosphere. In the end, the young frontline soldier once again confirmed that they had overcome that giant ant together. After all, Garrosh is an unsurpassed warrior, just like Royd. The orc was sincerely ashamed and embarrassed after such pleasant words in his direction. On this positive note, the man decided to bring up the topic of helping 120 orcs to work again. And this time, Garrosh expressed his unquestioning consent to this. Exactly a week later, the men set out for the sandy valley that lay beyond the green forest on the outskirts of the city. And so soon, the three of them reached the village of the Steel Sand orcs. Their wigwams looked very interesting, built of wood and bones, and decorated with their national symbol, the coat of arms. It seemed as if the men's long journey in search of labor was over. But the tribal leader and Barosh's father, Akush, regretfully informed Royd that they would not be able to fulfill his request. Royd was shocked that the orcs began to fight back. However, the man did not give up hope and decided to politely ask the chief the reason for his refusal. Akush explained that they were not strong enough to perform this task. They needed to eat meat to stay strong. And if they don't go hunting, their muscles will become extremely weak, and the loss of strength will lead to the decline of their tribe of Steel Sand. Therefore, they cannot reduce the number of warriors they need to go hunting. Royd interrupted Akush's explanation to ask if they go hunting every day. The chief confirmed that they did, because their muscles would weaken if the orcs did not eat meat every day. Gabriel thought it was ridiculous that the orcs were obsessed with their own muscles. He explained to the owner that for these creatures, protein and muscles are the meaning of life. Therefore, it would be better for everyone to give up this business. Royd heard the orcs' needs and thought about a compromise. So he approached the leader with the idea that if the meat did not spoil for several days, they would not have to go hunting every day. And as a result, they could provide workers for his mine. Akucha agreed with this statement because they wanted to repay the saviors for the return of their son. So this option was quite possible. Royd enthusiastically suggested to the chief that they could keep the meat fresh for a while. But first they had to go back a bit to remember the time when they had first arrived in the orc village. Barosh was crying out for his father's name. Akucha, also in tears, could not believe that he was seeing his son. Barosh ran like hell to meet his father. In return, the excited father ran to his son. People and orcs watched this sentimental spectacle. And at that very moment, the father and son united in a strong embrace, clinging to each other as strongly as possible. This powerful collision in the village of Steel Sand shook the ground and raised dust. It was just a hug, but the effect was so moving. Roth thought that if he had been standing between them, he would have been ground to dust in a second. And then he realized that if he could attract 120 such brave craftsmen, their production would soar thousands of times. However, there was one more thing that deserved attention. Harash brought and showed his father the head of the queen of the mutant ants. Akucha, along with his subjects, was proud of his son and announced to everyone present that a celebration would be held in his honor. Later, Royd had the opportunity to watch the orcs train with the help of golden items and jewelry. This spectacle impressed the man greatly. After all, they used golden columns as ordinary dumbbells in the gym. The young frontline soldier could not understand what they were doing with these golden things. He had the impression that the orcs were taking them out of thin air, because these precious things cost 10 times more than any other sports equipment. That's why the Great One signed a construction contract with the leader of the Shark. This way, they would get both labor and treasure. The men intended to build a stone-cold storage facility for storing meat. And in return, they would receive various precious items. However, Gabriel noticed that they would need special tools to work with the stones. The servant had never heard of such a vault, so he decided to ask his master about it. Ruth reminded Xavier that royal wizards could keep food fresh with the cooling power of ice magic. A cold store was a place that was used for the same purpose, but without the use of magic. Gabriel was extremely surprised by his master's knowledge, but he was too lazy to explain to his servant what he knew and how he knew it. First of all, they needed granite to create the refrigerator because it is very strong. Roy pointed to a granite rock to make his words clear. Something told Gabriel that it would not be an easy task to get this stone. Roy confirmed his assumption. Although they didn't have any explosives with them, they had a great substitute. The young front man turned to face Gabriel and pointed at him. After all, he already had a man with explosives ready. Xavier guessed that his boss wanted to use him in this situation. This was one of the key moments of the novel The Steel Knight. It told the story of the famous city of Mamaram. It was located on top of a cliff, surrounded by a pink glow. The city was imprisoned inside a magical barrier. At that time, thousands of refugees inside the city were the prisoners that Xavier was supposed to save. By that time Gabriel had almost become a sword master, and his mana heart possessed the 4th mana ring. For some time, he watched powerlessly as the mana was sucked out of the hearts of the city's captives. He had to save them even at the cost of his own life. In this way, without realizing it, he created a new skill of propulsion. His secret was to protect the main heart of the mana with one ring, and to channel the power of the other 3 rings into a blow of incredible power. Then all the power of the 3 mana rings passed from the heart into his hand, and from there into his sword. This led to a powerful explosion. As a result of the formation of a large blast wave, Xavier literally flew upwards, and then he fell to the ground. After that, this explosion became the same technique that, together with Azrahan's mind technique, represented the Steel Knight. Royd asked if they could use the same technique now. Instead, Gabriel wanted to know how the master had learned about this theory. Royd said that it was the first time he had thought of this technique, and his eyes did not contain a lie inside. Xavier was annoyed by the owner's eyes, because he saw lies in them. The embarrassed Royd tried not to show his excitement, and asked him to just try it. Gabriel believed that the owner would still do it his way. However, the young frontier urged the servant to always wish each other only good. He also promised to make an effort if Xavier succeeded in his theory. That would be a definite plus for the Baron's son. Gabriel approached the rock to try to apply his propulsion technique. To do this, he needed to protect the mana heart with one ring and release the other three by force of impact. And at the same moment, the man made a decisive sword strike into the granite rock. A bright light began to radiate from the place of impact in a second. Roy thought that Gabriel had succeeded on the first try. From the dust cloud, the silhouette of Xavier was moving toward the host. Coming closer, the man noticed that his outerwear was torn. Gabriel was in a stern mood and wanted to know if the owner had planned this. Roy did not plan it, but he was sorry that it happened. But in any case, Xavier was happy that this time the master's plan worked. Next was the young Frontera's turn. The messenger told the owner that Xavier was grateful for this lesson. Gabriel's level of sympathy for him increased by 3 points. The overall level of sympathy for the host was minus 11 points. He also received 54 RPs for improving his relationship with a key character. The total number of RPs was 561 points. Gabriel shared his thoughts that the master knows his skill and should use it to protect the Baron. But now he uses it for construction. Roy took these words as gratitude from his servant. But that was not the case at all. Since then, construction has progressed much faster. The granite that Xavier split and shaped was delivered to the construction site by a hamster called Padong. The orcs tried to free people from hard physical work so that they would not break their backs, even though no one asked them to do so. But the orcs, who were addicted to training, were doing all the work themselves. After all, lowering and lifting large granite blocks was like a normal workout for them. Royd assumed that at this rate, they would finish the construction 5 times faster. For the next stage, they only needed ice and insulation. The man asked Xavier how long it had been since he had sent his workers to get the insulation material. He replied that it had been exactly 3 weeks. They should have been back by now. Gabriel assumed that either their soldiers were too lazy or something else might have affected their speed. Roy thought that something might have happened to them on the way back. The man got up from the stone to find out what had happened to his soldiers. But Gabriel stopped him from doing so. Xavier offered to go in search of the soldiers himself if that was the only task. He believed that the owner should not go with him, because they could not know for sure what had happened to the people. However, Roy reminded him that they had already discussed this topic with the servant. The young frontman again explained that he was responsible for organizing the construction, and therefore was fully responsible for his workers. Gabriel had no choice but to exhale and agree with his master on this point. The men immediately set out on the road. They passed through sandy rocky areas where there was not a single living thing or plant. Suddenly Roy noticed a lost glove of one of his workers in the sand. It was one of the gloves he had recently ordered for his men to use when working with insulation. While the man was looking at the glove, Gabriel noticed something else. Xavier showed his host a crevice from which a very strange atmosphere was coming. Roy did not understand what was so strange about this crevice. But Gabriel explained that the mana flowed here in a rather unusual way. Everything was somehow blurry and imprecise. The young frontiersman thought about the servant's words. He remembered that he had already encountered something like this while reading a novel about the Knight of Steel. After realizing his own memories, fear appeared on Royd's face. The man ordered Xavier to leave the place quickly with him. Gabriel did not understand his host's reaction. The swarm anxiously told Xavier that most likely their soldiers were no longer alive. Gabriel was both surprised and frightened by his host's words. Later, after a difficult journey through the rocky terrain, the men reached the foot of a strange gorge. Royd noticed small piles of straw near the entrance to the cave. The man took a handful of straw from the ground with him, which surprised Gabriel a bit. The young frontline soldier tightly gripped the dry grass in his hand and prepared himself for any circumstances. Royd explained to Xavier that they had reached the Ruffulon Gorge. After all, at the very beginning of the novel, this place was mentioned as one of Xavier's goals, because it was here that the dark wizard Ruffulon lived. The man was furious that this magician could do something to his soldiers. After all, trespassing on private property was supposed to be punishable. The owner's thoughts were interrupted by Xavier, who ordered him to follow him through the cave. Royd did not have time to stop the servant as he stood on the floor with his foot and caused a strange magical reaction of the stone, which began to shine. Royd barely had time to take Gabriel back by the collar. A moment later, a small explosion sounded where the man was standing. Xavier was amazed that there were magic traps in the cave. Royd asked the servant if he was really a knight, because a real knight should calculate such moments in advance. In the novel, Xavier fell into the same trap when he was wounded and looking for shelter. But his Gabriel never repeated his mistakes twice. And then the knight rushed to the exit of the cave. Since the flow of mana in this city was unusual, Royd suggested that the man apply his technique here as well. Gabriel knew that in the natural environment mana was in a state of constant uninterrupted concentration in the atmosphere. Thus, he could understand where the magical traps were laid in the skull. It was by sensing a certain unusual concentration of mana in one place. Gabriel listened to his feelings and concentrated. In a moment, he was already leading his young master forward. Royd noticed that the servant's senses were quite well developed. As Gabriel walked cautiously forward, he thought that Royd was only doing what he was doing, lying to him and insisting. But now everything is different. Xavier did not understand what was going on. After all, the young frontman had somehow predicted various events before they happened. But how did he do it? Gabriel did not feel any special energy from him, although on the other hand it could be a very powerful mana. As a result, the man came to the conclusion that first they had to deal with what awaited them ahead. They needed to save all the prisoners as soon as possible. A few meters away, the men noticed a silhouette in a black robe holding a book. At that moment, the cloaked man felt the presence of strangers in his cave and turned in their direction. The man was glad that his trap had worked and that someone had visited him. He was interested in thinking about who it could be. The man closed the book and was sure that he would soon find out for himself. He believed that his preparation was complete. His experiment had to be successful, so he immediately opened the bolt on the stout metal door. Behind it, on the stone floor, young Royd's workers sat tied up and frightened. The magician chose one of them and, at the prisoner's begging, dragged him by the scruff of the neck into another room. In a moment, the laborer was lying inside the red magic circle depicted on the floor of the ceremonial hall. The magician had everything he needed for the experiment: a magic circle, a ruthless scythe of a priest, and most importantly, a young human life. The man sharply swung the scythe at the worker. He screamed and cried pitifully, waiting for his end. And at the same moment, behind him, the magician heard a voice addressing him. The dark wizard turned around in surprise, and was shocked by what he saw. Royd and Xavier addressed him, and ordered the man not to touch their worker. The magician was not happy with the intruders, because he could not understand how they had avoided his traps. Worried for his safety, he quickly began to lower the metal gate with the help of magic to prevent the men from getting inside. The metal curtain dropped sharply in front of them. Behind the men, too. White, Thick smoke began to pour out from under the cracks in the metal gate. Royd inhaled the remaining fresh air and held his breath to avoid falling into the dark wizard's new trap. Royd had managed to hold his breath, and so he felt confident, but Gabriel did not. The magician intended to put the guests to sleep with sleeping magic in order to deal with them later. When the space between the two metal walls was filled with sleep magic, Royd used his Zichik skill. He got 10 minutes to not feel tired at all, although he was sure that a few minutes would be enough. After all, he was not in an ant tunnel now. Xavier had never taken medication to treat insomnia, so no sleeping pills were going to work on him. Royd had already gone too far. He dug a rather long tunnel that ran under the metal wall in the direction of the magician's hideout. Gabriel noticed that his master looked like a mole with a shovel, and he would laugh at this on occasion. Royd gestured for Xavier to go downstairs to him. As the servant tried to apply his driving technique, the young front man crouched down with his ears covered. Gabriel concentrated the power of the mana rings in his sword, and with all his strength he struck the ground. This caused a great explosion. When he saw it, the mod did not know what to do, because he was terribly frightened by the skills of ordinary people. His face was full of horror. When the dust settled, it was possible to see a hole in the ceremonial floor of the magician. The hand of one of the men appeared from there. It was a swarm holding onto the stones and climbing to the surface. He crawled slowly toward the magician with an unwavering fury on his face. He had never seen such a large monster before. The wizard kept his magic ready to repel the intruders. With a sharp movement, he directed it all to the floor. In a moment, a giant, terrible two-headed giant appeared from the magic glow. Even though his experience had been a failure so far, it was his most powerful creation. It was virtually invulnerable, with only its steel armor worth a damn. Its giant arm was approaching the men. Royd told Gabriel that it would not be easy for them. He also tried to tell him that his weakness was his legs. But Xavier immediately desperately rushed into the fight. Xavier used his propulsion technique again, but this time in the fight against the magical giant. With his sword, he created a powerful tornado wave that covered the monster's head. In one incredible move, Gabriel split the magician's creature exactly in half from head to toe. The magician's face was full of horror and shock. He could not believe that this was really happening. Royd was no less surprised by this result than the magician. Royd could not believe that Gabriel had used the power of the explosion as an auxiliary force, which gave him the opportunity to split the monster in half. But for some reason, his novel did not mention this technique. Meanwhile, Gabriel stood calmly over the body of the defeated giant, sword at the ready. Fearless and proud of themselves, the men stood in front of the magician, staring unwaveringly ahead. The wizard trembled before them and realized that no matter what he did, he could not defeat them. Royd sat down leaning forward and spoke disdainfully to the magician. He told the man in the cloak that due to the disappearance of his workers, the construction of the young Frontera had stopped. And since it was the work of a magician, he had to pay Royd back somehow. The magician decided to lie down on the ground in order to survive in any way possible, and to apologize for his evil deed. However, Royd was not interested in his words at that moment. He wanted to receive compensation for the damage he had caused. Realizing the man's intention, the magician said that he had many valuable things that he would give them. This greatly amused the young Frontera's inner greed. Going to the storeroom where the prisoners were kept, Gabriel told the owner that the soldiers were very exhausted, but their lives were not in danger. Royd was pleased with this news. Royd tried to ask the magician why he needed all these people, because in a few days they could have been dead with such an attitude. The magician was dumbfounded, but still dared to tell the man his plans as they would not become a reality. The magician told him that he was conducting unusual experiments to find out how to bring people back to life. Royd furrowed his brow and asked the man why he needed to do this. Sitting on his knees, The magician was extremely touched and saddened by the man's words. After all, he was doing all this to find a way to get his wife and son back. Royd thought about it, because he did not expect that the magician could have had a family before. The man said that he used to be a magician in the estate of a baron. He lived an ordinary life with his beloved wife and son. Although no, his life was not ordinary, it was happy. But one day the baron, whom he had served so faithfully, suddenly wanted to take his wife away from him. So on the same day, he tried to escape with her and his son. But the baron still pursued them. At this point, the swordmaster interrupted the magician's sensitive story, explaining that he did not believe the man's words. After all, if he had saved his wife and son, while taking the lives of hundreds of innocent people, it would have been very cruel. And his family would definitely not have thanked him for such a salvation. As well as for the ruthless creatures he created, the lives and happiness of the families of those people whose lives he took. Royd believed that his story did not deserve pity. Gabriel took all the soldiers out of the storeroom, and noticed that no matter what the magician told them, his true gut could not be changed. Xavier tried to suppress the magician by telling him that it was he who had broken the happy lives of many families, and that he would remain who he really was. Endless hot tears rolled down from the magician's eyes. Royd was glad that at least he could still cry. The man told the magician that he would soon return with reinforcements to his cave to take all his magic and precious things. And if he tried to harm anyone else in the meantime, he should not expect forgiveness this time. The magician was extremely shocked by the man's verdict. In the end, he bowed to the men and thanked them for their kindness and humanity. Then Royd remembered that in the novel, Xavier also forgave the magician, and he later left the cave. But after that, the magician took the lives of hundreds more innocent people. He even conducted an experiment on himself. He turned into an uncontrollable and annoying thief who challenged Xavier again and again. And even though Royd knew about it, he turned his back on him to make sure of his assumption. At first, the magician stood motionless and just cried in front of the man, but as they were about to leave, the unexpected happened. He suddenly looked at the men from under his cloak, planning something insidious. The magician's eyes concentrated on the negative that came from his gut. Seeing Royd's alcohol, the mage felt that he still had a chance to get back at them and destroy them all with the use of dark magic. The magician was rapidly approaching the man and could already taste his own victory. However, at the same moment Royd turned around, looking into the magician's eyes. He said that he never forgave him. The magician wondered how Royd had learned about his intentions and true identity. The man knew in advance what he would eventually lead them to. For Gabriel, this meant only one thing. He had to give the magician a chance to think about his actions. And in the same instant, with a sharp and as always precise sword movement, Xavier beheaded the magician. Then she flew off swiftly to the side, and his body remained motionless. More than once in his life, young Kim Soo Ho heard remarks about himself. That he was just a miserable fool who was rotten to the core. There was a man who constantly scolded him for no reason. He called the boy a ragamuffin and ordered him to bend over 90 degrees when greeting him. It was very hard on the boy because it was becoming more and more difficult to withstand the constant remarks. And so it went on and on. While Kim was working at a construction site, the guy reassured himself that there was nothing wrong with his remarks. Later, he tried to restrain himself from quarreling, and then from physically assaulting the offender. The man often said that young people needed to be taught everything because without them, they could only eat on their own. The boy hoped that if he was polite to this man, he would change for the better. Thinking about it this way, he tried to come to terms with the situation. But where did it lead? When he continued to show politeness and tolerance to the man, he continued to resent and quarrel with him instead. He only saw Kim as a punching bag. On that day, the man called him abusive names once again. Kim Soo Ho could barely contain his anger. Soon it would all be over if he held back. After all, if he caused a scandal, he would only make things worse for himself. But in this moment of internal struggle inside the boy, the man added that only a worthless mother could have given birth to such a worthless son, and then laughed. At the same time, uncontrollable rage filled the boy's body. He approached the man and put his hand on his shoulder. And immediately his face changed dramatically. It craved revenge and punishment for the offender. In a moment, his fist entered the face of the man who had been harassing him for so long.